For today, then, we have our last in a series, and the reason we have sort of collated these is because we felt there was still some. See, Abdullah, you remember it, don't you? Um, there's still some myths out there that we wanted to get into and tackle that seem to still be pervasive in some kind of way. So, Marvin and I, we put our heads together and we felt we could sort of squeeze another what have we got, six or so from this, and we also have included some of the ones commented within the sign up as well at the end, so we can get into those as well. Again, always, the purpose of this is to have an open session. So, any questions, any comments, anything like that, please do pipe up in the chat box. This should be a bit of a shorter session. So there'll be plenty of time for questions and to delve into things and everything else. So let's get things underway. And I think the first one here is something that actually we see a fair bit. And I think, Nov, you may have done this a little bit of time ago, where if you miss a workout or miss a couple of workouts, you feel like you have to catch up for them. Yeah, you have to make up for them. And often this is done in a pretty like excessive way. So setting the scene, right? Someone has a busy week and then they miss their sessions, and then maybe on a Friday they do two workouts back to back, so two planned workouts. And the funny thing is, like, each workout probably is about an hour, right? So they're spending now like 2 hours, 2.5 hours getting all of this volume in. And so, we feel this really comes from the fact that you have to kind of like overcompensate if we miss something. Also, the kind of no pain, no gain, all or nothing mentality. So you kind of go from missing something earlier in the week totally to then thinking like you have to catch up on everything at the weekend. And as that is not a sort of practical or a sustainable way to manage such occasions, right? And so, whilst yes, it feels like you're ticking the boxes, it can relieve some guilt. It kind of has you feeling like you're pushing and you're making up for something, that more work always equals better results. That is not necessarily the case, because our bodies, they can only sort of do so much, right? They can only put so much effort in or perform at a certain rate, and also they can only recover from a certain amount of volume at a certain rate. So if you're overdoing things, then there's two issues here, right? If you are to say catch up on two sessions at the weekend, having missed some over the course of the week, there's going to be sort of two sort of things that happen. One, in order to do those two sessions, your performance is probably going to drop considerably. So instead of doing one session at like 110% effort, right, you're now spacing that over two sessions back to back, and you're only probably performing at like 60% effort, right? So for us, we would rather you are able to, if you miss a week, say, get the first workout in, give it your rule, and just feel like you're getting back on track there. There's no need to overcompensate. There's no need to try and do more, because ultimately the performance is going to suffer. The quality of the workout is going to suffer. And then the problem, what happens the following day or the following couple of days, you then get the muscle soreness, right? You may then push your body too far, that actually you need 2 days off now, for example. And so you're then having to over recover for the amount of time you spent training. So what would be a sensible approach is maybe then you do one workout on the Friday and then one workout the next day, for example. So just it's really about resuming and picking up where you left off, right? Resume the schedule as normal. We can help you shift the workouts along, and really, like, there's no sort of lost time, right? Whatever's happened in the previous week or two, it's happened. It's now just to get back in the saddle and sort of move on in a more sort of productive way. Anything to add there, Marvin, or does that sort of cover that off? Because I know
Yeah, I
you
mean,
sort of have a lot of these questions from people saying, should I do two workouts? Should I catch up?
yeah, and I think one of the other interesting things is that, like, when you think about a lot of other areas in life that may not necessarily, be on par with how we view fitness, is that like, uh, let's say you have a payment, whatever car payment, whatever, right? Like you miss that payment, that means your interest rate goes up, you end up having to pay more, or there's a penalty or a fine, right? Maybe you need to pay, I don't know, someone in your house or help or work or whatever the case may be, and there's like that feeling of guilt because I haven't done X. So there's like a consequence for not doing what you should do. Whereas with fitness and training, maybe that mentality then spills over. And it's actually, as Peter has outlined very, very clearly, that this is not the case, right? We have all these other problems that come with that. So just a really interesting sort of, just because this is what applies to everyday normal life doesn't necessarily carry over into our fitness.
Mm. And then just in response to Abdullah's comment here, right? I mean, he says guilt, right? That is the thing that's driving this for a lot of people. The other thing is, Abdullah, I would say, if you are adapting more of a kind of temporary program or a full body type routine to get back on track afterwards, then that could be sensible. But this would be kind of an individual case, right? So for example, if you missed a week of training and you're going to get back into everything as usual the following week, then there's no need to kind of change things up. Just hit the program again and you're good. If, however, you are like, guys, like for the next month, it's going to be intense. I can't hit my 4 or 5 sessions. We would then say, okay, maybe it's time to actually, for that period, move over to like 3 days a week with a full body approach. So, yes, you're getting in or you're hitting the muscles and the movements more frequently than you would for like an upper lower or push pull legs or something like that. So it would depend really on what's happening after, if that makes sense as well. Nice. So if you are injured, you should stop all activity until you're fully recovered. And to be honest, this is one that upsets me quite a lot on lots of different fronts. So for me and Marvin, we have played all sorts of contact sport and we have unfortunately gone through all sorts of injuries, right? For me, my ankle's basically been ripped apart many different times. I've had knee operations, I've torn my pec. I've had all sorts of shoulder issues and an appendix and all this kind of stuff, right? So operations, procedures, injuries. And a lot of the time, people get injured in one particular place in their body, right? Maybe that's their ankle, their knee, their toe, their shoulder, whatever. And most of the time, on doctor's orders, it's a case of don't go to the gym, just totally rest. And I think if you are in a position where you are not necessarily like in love with your training and what it's doing and making progress, then a lot of time people are going to see, okay, the doctor said this, don't train. They're going to see it as a good excuse to not go to the gym and to not carry on, to blame this externality of, I've got a bad knee, I can't train. And that kind of is understandable, right? Because, previously injuries have been treated with a prescription of rest everything, don't make it worse. And it's this blanket recommendation. You don't want to get it worse. There's that fear, there's that lack of confidence now from, is this going to cause pain? Is it going to make it worse? And also, this advice, this getting the wrong advice from the wrong people. So, for example, going to your GP, going to the doctor, going to get an X-ray, whatever it might be, rather than someone who's more of a specialist in the field, like a sports physiotherapist. And so, a lot of the time, if you're working with a coach or a sports physio, they're actually going to get you to do stuff, right? Because the problem is, and obviously it depends on the injury, the problem is if you don't move the area that is affected, right? The problem is it's going to get weaker. And as it gets weaker, there's going to be more pain. And as that happens, it's then this vicious cycle. And we always say, like there is always something you can do, no matter what the injury. So, for example, me here, this is me after tearing like my pec, right? On some fucking bench press. But anyway, for me, what could I do? Great, I could like work on my cardio. I could train the legs. I tested out some back movements and I could still train my back. So whilst rehabbing the chest and the shoulder area, there was still 80% of my body that I could still train. And Marvin, I'm sure there's been times where you've had such instances as well.
Yeah, I remember very vividly two situations. One was a fracture to this knuckle here, and every now and then there's been some nerve damage, so I still get a little bit of a like a twitching hand. But that happened playing rugby, not fighting, and it was really interesting how the prescription was complete total rest, right? And in reality, I could still do so much stuff. Of course, I started to value my pinky because you really don't value some of these little things until you get injured. But I obviously couldn't hold barbells, couldn't hold things. And so I was, relegated to machines, but I could still train my legs. So there I was in the gym, 3 times a week, hitting my legs hard. And it was actually a time where, the legs, something that was such a big weakness, became a strength. And, in the off season, became more powerful, stronger, able to break tackles. So it actually turned what was an injury into a strength. And it's really interesting how that sort of, because it could have easily been, oh, I'm injured, or this or that, I can't move, I can't do that, I'm going to lose muscle, strength, all this stuff. But I actually was able to turn that and flip it on its head completely.
Sure, and a lot of the problems with like overuse injuries, for example, tendonitis, right? If like they only will get better if you strengthen them. So no amount of rest, even if you rest for a year, people still have the pain. And so it's really important that yes, you don't aggravate it and you work with a specialist to overcome it. So for example, like we've got Amani, who's one of our A-star students. I think she's 100% consistent on these calls. And, she's just overcome like an elbow issue, right? Which was affecting her grip. And so that's exactly what we did. We changed the training, we adapted so that, it was more lower focused. We still worked the upper body, but in ways that weren't sort of aggravating the injury. And now, she's been signed off and we're going to get back into things gradually. And so people believe this because, they don't want to create bigger problems, right? If something hurts, there's an alarm bell. It's best to rest it. And again, listening to doctors, for example, again, I'm going to call out Monera here. I think she's still on the call, where the advice from the doctor for her back pain was do not do any lifting. And now what, Monera, you're 9 months in, I think, and you have just leveled up the dumbbells at home, you've bought more, you've been training in the gym, and all this kind of stuff. And that was from, just introducing movement to get the muscles stronger to overcome the pain. And so, again, like, I'm so thrilled that you obviously trusted us to get you to that point where you can actually move confidently without feeling like you're a 90-year-old, old age person who is like doesn't have an ability to do anything. Right. We all have the ability to get stronger. And just because we have an injury, it doesn't mean that everything is on hold. And everyone here, I think, is a type of person who is always going to look for a way to overcome something or work around something. Hence why you're on this call and you've all been sort of making progress rather than people who, will just use it as an excuse to not do anything. So if and when anything comes up, hopefully not, you kind of have a better an action plan here. So I'll pass over to Marvin here.
So what's also interesting around injuries is just to touch on that real quick before we move on is I don't know if anyone has heard the phrase or the quote to someone with a hammer, everything is a nail, right? So like a lot of people end up going to like an orthopedic, for example. Not knocking
Mm.
bones, they're great, right? Obviously, they know what they're doing. They're going to be fantastic at, dealing with bones. And so you have, some knee issue, some cartilage issue, and this and that. And you're like, oh, let me go and see an ortho. And what are they going to do, right? Their specialty is, surgery, right? And so as opposed to where you probably could have rehabbed, could have strength trained, could have combined strength training, rehabbing, proper nutrition to help with inflammation, all these other things you could have done, and then only gone for surgery as like a last case, sort of situation. So always really important to, obviously communicate with us, but also, we can always refer you to sports physios and people that we can work together with, because then it's a collaborative approach with us and them rather than going to someone that's just going to give you this blanket, protocol or nothing, or let's go to surgery under the knife immediately.
Yeah, and I think just on that, I don't want to labor the point too much, as I think we've sort of cemented it. But I remember a time when I was in my late 20s and I was having hip pain, and I went to this physio, and she was like, it's a torn hip labrum. The only way to get around this is surgery, and I know a great surgeon, and passed me his number and this kind of stuff. Honestly, after that, I was so defeated. I was like, Matt, surgery, like I'm gonna lose all this muscle, I'm gonna like, get weaker and all this kind of stuff, like rehab. And then I went to another physio, another sports physio, and he was like, are they shitting me? Like, absolutely not. This would be the worst thing to do. Fast forward 2 months, the pain was gone, and I've never felt it since. And so, again, like these things, they may seem so debilitating at the time, especially if they've been chronic. But working with a specialist, really can be the way to overcome it. So anyway,
Yeah, I have another story about injuries, but we'll tackle
man, we
that.
could go on and on. I'm
Yeah,
sure. I'm sure.
we really could. As you can tell, we are broken bodies. Next myth is that you need to feel motivated before taking action. When we were sort of preparing this, I was thinking about, is it The Last Dance, right? Which I'm sure everyone binged watched over on Netflix and during COVID, right? The MJ Michael Jordan
Mm.
documentary. Like I remember watching that and thinking I can run through a brick wall.
Man, for sure.
Just the amount of motivation you get from watching some of these documentaries, reading self-help books and the Although Ego is the Enemy and all these types of books, like they can be very useful, like great to be inspired by these things. But oftentimes we then think the feeling that we feel when we watch or read or do these things or see some cool quote or watch some motivational video is how we're going to feel all the time, right? So often we see people starting their journey with this burst of enthusiasm for the first couple of weeks, 3, 4 weeks, maybe a month, maybe two. And then they feel like that, they're meant to feel the same way the whole time. Like even think about when you set your goals for the new year. This is another point, right? Like Pete, we worked in gyms, in our formative years, and January, February was like peak, right? Because everyone's motivated, everyone's ready, everyone wants to, get rid of whatever fluff they got on over Christmas and New Year's. And they're like, new year, new me. And so there's this like sudden burst of motivation, and people think it lasts forever. When in reality, what we actually know is that that's not the case, right? There's this. I think we'll get over to it the slide after this, where we talk about the rule of thirds and how you really should feel. But why do people believe this myth, right? Motivation feels good, right? It's good to feel motivated. You have this, rush of adrenaline and dopamine and all these feel good hormones that are encouraging you and pushing you to do something that's going to inspire change. So it's fantastic. It's great to be motivated, right? We also tend to believe it because, we remember those days that we're motivated. So we think of the days we were motivated and we think we should always be that way. But then we forget the days when we've done something well and succeeded despite not doing it or not feeling motivated, you know? So to go on to the next slide, Pete, the one with the rule of thirds, how we want to think of how we feel with regards to chasing a specific goal, your health journey, being stronger, being fitter, being like all these things is what we think is we should be 100% on it, feeling amazing. But in reality, sometimes you feel amazing. Sometimes you feel okay. You can kind of get by. Yeah, I'm going to go to the gym, I'm going to get my workout in. I'm just doing it. And then there are other times where it's like, man, I can't be bothered. I really just cannot be bothered. And that's fine too, right? And so we always want to be mindful of these things, that these are the areas that we're often going to be one of these three. We're not always going to feel fantastic. Pete, I remember you mentioned this recently as well. I don't remember who was asking, but they were like, I don't feel so good. I don't feel so
Yes,
motivated. I
yes,
don't
sir.
feel good at the gym."
Yes. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's like I feel like we feel like there's something wrong if we aren't feeling motivated or we feel demotivated or that initial burst is no longer with us. And I think a lot of the time it's just accepting that, that's okay. That is natural, that is perfectly normal. And I think because the emotions can be so strong in all of these phases, well, particularly the good sort of, phase when everything is great and you're feeling motivated, but also when you're not feeling motivated, like the emotions can be so strong, they can be so heavy, they can dictate so much behavior. And so I think just knowing that, like this rule of thirds, I think allows you to ride through those moments which are just a bit shit and then get you back to feeling better when the time comes. Because this is about everything in life, right? Same with relationships, I'm sure. A lot of time, you can't expect to be with your partner and feel amazing all the time. You're going to go through these challenges and you're going to go through these periods where it's just a bit, meh, going through the motions. But, there's learnings that can be taken with each of those.
Yeah, and there's a lot of value, I think, in doing things that you don't want to do. Because as Pete said, like some of the times we're not going to want to do things, right? So if we always chasing this, I need to feel good, I need to be motivated, therefore I will then do something, then you're never going to take action, right? We actually see that through like a lot of studies and research around behavior change, that action, precedes motivation. So once you actually want to get going first, right? Creating that consistency, the momentum, getting you get that feeling of like a snowball, like you get the snowball and going and more snow sort of piles up, or the domino effect where you start with one thing and then the dominoes start to fall. So then the next thing, then the next thing, then the next thing. And so you really want to focus on action rather than I need to be motivated, right? And we often speak about how discipline is much greater than motivation because motivation comes in spurts, whether it's when you watch something, when you think about something, when you are just generally motivated, right? Whereas discipline is something you do when no one's watching, when you don't feel like doing it, when you have all these systems in place, when I don't remember who mentioned this, but like setting their training schedule like it's a meeting, right? That's discipline. You're not motivated all the time. But if you know that I've got my workout at 5 p.m. after work, I'm going to go get it done, and you get it done, that's discipline. You're not necessarily always going to feel excited to go and do your workout.
For sure. I think Abdullah's got a good point here where he's like, okay, if you're feeling shit, right, you don't go to the gym, then you have this guilt from not going. And then it's kind of this vicious cycle because that then leads you to feel even more crappy. And so, like, I think each and every one of you here has probably had many times when you do not want to go to the gym, but you go anyway. And after the session, you're like, thank God I went. I feel so much better. So, even though, like, I always sort of talk about this, like Friday morning, the alarm goes at, 5:30 in the morning. That's the only time I can run at the Corniche on the weekend. Like, the only thing that's getting me up is the thought of knowing that in 2 hours' time I could go back to bed knowing that I've done something well and I'll be happy with it, rather than hitting snooze and then living my Friday knowing that I could have done this thing and I didn't, and I'm kicking myself and I'm guilty. So that is always a good sort of frame for this, is just think about how you'll feel after you do the thing. And I'm sure each and every one of you has, again, never regretted a session.
Yeah, and one of the other advice or pieces of advice we often give people is like when you're not feeling great, you don't want to go, show up, right? Because obviously showing up is the hardest part. And then once you've gotten to the gym, say to yourself, I'm going to do the first two or the first three exercises. I think we've spoken about this before on calls. And oftentimes, after doing those two or three exercises, you feel great and you just keep going. Other times you may not feel great and you just coast and you still finish the whole session at 50%, 60%. But what you did was you went and you did something you didn't want to do, and you've essentially grown that muscle of doing things you don't want to do. And then the other times you may only just do the two or three and then leave and be done. You've done 15 minutes. But again, something's better than nothing. You've done the big bang for your buck compound lifts. So there's still a lot of benefits to doing, that workout, getting that done.
For sure. And I think sort of last point on this really is we all have these ambitious goals, and all these goals are going to stretch us. The problem is who we are at the moment is not going to get us to those goals, right? This is why we need these systems. And if you do not have any systems in place, if you do not have any routines in place or structure, then there's nothing to kind of support you getting there. Whether that is a plan, whether that is, a non-negotiable for you that every, I don't know, Sunday, Wednesday, and Thursday you go to the gym in the morning. Like, all of the systems that support you are there when you aren't motivated and when you don't feel like doing it, but you do it anyway because those are the systems that you've built to support you in this journey, and those are the things that are going to get you to your goal.
On to this next one. One bad day ruins progress. I think we've all felt this one before, right? After whatever occasion has happened, whether it's a bit of a Friday get together with people and you end up eating a little bit more than you sort of intended to do, or you get a craving and you sort of succumb to that craving. And so we think this one bad day completely ruined, all our progress. And this is a really nice graph that Peter's put here, right? Where when we sort of zoom out and see the bigger picture, right? If you see how, there's progress is never linear, right? There's always going to be peaks and troughs, ebbs and flows. And so we see here on this graph, where there's a little bit of a bad day. And oftentimes, if we're able to then pick ourselves up, as Pete touched on previously with the systems, right? You've got all these systems in place. You've got us to help you and support you. You've got your training that's scheduled. You've got your nutrition planned. You go back to your systems, relying on those systems. That bad day ceases to be, a problem or a bad day once you're getting back to those systems. And I think it's also worth noting or pointing out that these days are going to come, like it's inevitable. So this like idea of perfection and thinking that these days are never going to happen is completely
Wishful
false.
thinking.
Yeah, exactly. It's really false. So what do we see, right? We often see that after weeks and progress of or weeks or months of progress, client is derailed by a single event, which makes them feel like they've ruined everything. So case in point, as I've mentioned with the, one bad Friday. And this often comes from, one of the biggest ones is unsustainable diets that people have previously done. So I'll give you an example, right? Someone is eating 1,000 calories a day, like super low calories, and they're trying to lose weight, trying to change their body composition. And they go out and they go and have, McDonald's and, big shake, and that meal is 1,000 calories. So they've essentially doubled their food intake in one day, in comparison to what they normally do. Of course, that one bad day is going to feel like it's the worst thing ever, right? Because then maybe they step on the scale and they see this big number and they see things moving. And so when you've done things that are very unsustainable, any sort of wiggle room, there's very little wiggle room for you to, you have to always be perfect. So essentially what we're trying to say is don't always seek perfection. Don't try and do these very extreme things that aren't going to be sustainable. We always want to be seeking progress as opposed to perfection. We also don't want to be focusing on the day-to-day, right? We often don't think about the bigger picture. We often want to just be like zeroing in on this one day, day-to-day, but we don't think about the bigger picture. As we saw, progress is not linear in that previous graph. Pete, could you move on to the next slide? So we tend to focus on mistakes more than successes, right? We all know that the human mind is very wired and geared towards negativity, right? It's almost like we have to talk ourselves out of negativity, right? And so this is one thing that makes people believe this. One indulgent meal feels very emotionally significant when a diet is extremely restrictive, which we've sort of touched on. And then the big one is social media, right? As we see more and more, whether it's influencers or people you aspire to be like, or, we're always seeing the highlights, right? With no context of the rest of their lives. And so we assume that, when you see that person's meal and they post, their best meals, they're not posting everything else. And so we assume that we also need to live up to this, like, quote unquote, perfection, right? Pete, I'm sure you've had to answer several questions around this.
Of course, and something comes to mind actually. I don't know if people have seen it, but there's this guy called Stephen Bartlett. He's Diary of a CEO, man. And some of his stuff is really, really good. And I don't know if it's just the circles that I'm in or the kind of algorithm pushing it my way, but at the moment there is something like it's a clip from one of his shows where he's like, I had 2 glasses of wine one night and my life was ruined for 3 days. And he's talking, utmost seriousness. And there is this, I feel like there's this pushback at the moment on like this over optimization culture where you've got to have your morning routines locked in. You can't deviate from the plan, otherwise it will ruin your life. this kind of stuff. And so it's so funny to see the narrative that is around this. And again, it's stuff like this that just perpetuates the thinking of, oh my God, if I do this one thing, it's going to ruin my productivity, or it's going to ruin my results, or it's going to ruin, what I've been going for, and everything is wasted. And so, like with most things, there's always a balance to things. And yeah, I think this is one that is sort of it I think a lot of the time comes from people wanting to be perfect because they're just starting, or they feel like everything's got to be in place so that everything goes well. But in reality, it's sort of life doesn't really operate like that or allow for that. And so knowing that bad days are going to happen is sort of part of the process. And most importantly, it's knowing how you then pick yourself up and not having that kind of lag from that one bad day or one bad decision kill you for like 2 3 weeks. Right, it's how can you pick yourself up? And just like we had with the first myth around 2 a day training, it's like, what is the thing that you need to do just to get back on track now, to restart the routine?
Yeah, exactly. And I think, I'll keep hammering the point home around nutrition, right? Often we get questions about meal plans and this and that. And this is one of those things, right? If you're following a very strict meal plan that we created for you and we give to you, right, you're going to deviate. And then when you do deviate, you feel guilty. And it's like one bad day, this is over, my life has crumbled. And, so we always want to be helping people understand that, when you're on this journey, it's about changing your lifestyle, not making these very drastic, very restrictive ways of doing things. Because when you live in this very restrictive way of doing things, there is no room for any, imperfections, which
Mhm.
as people, we all know we aren't perfect, right? So what's the truth? What's the solution? I think thinking about having a much bigger 10,000 foot view, right? Of thinking about what our journey is like, right? Every one of you would have sort of received a video when you first started around your journey. And something we've been trying to encourage people to really watch and really get into is understanding that this journey of health and fitness is, it's continuous, right? Where you start is not where you finish. So you go through discovery where it's still early days, it's still the beginning. You don't know what you don't know, right? You shift over into growth where you've kind of learned some things. You've learned how to make certain adjustments to your nutrition. You now know what protein is, how important it is, why it's important. Now in growth, you're now being much more consistent with, getting the targets that you've been given. And then you shift over onto Thrive, where now it's almost like what you learned in discovery and growth is like on autopilot, right? Often we have people on autopilot with bad habits. Now you're on autopilot with good habits, right? And then we shift over obviously into mastery. So just having this very big 10,000 foot view of my journey is, a much bigger than a day-to-day thing really makes you realize that that one bad day is absolutely nothing in the grand scheme of things. Any thoughts, Pete?
For sure. I mean, I love what Amani said here, and it's like a practice that helped me sort of to be able to celebrate and appreciate the small wins is sort of having some sort of like daily gratitude, writing down 3 things. And I think everyone's gonna have things which they gravitate to more, but it's kind of knowing what gaps you need to plug, what's going to be the biggest bang for your buck. And like we were saying earlier, it's not about trying to do everything at once when you're motivated and you're going to do this, you're going to do this, you're going to do gratitude, you're going to journal 3 times a day, so on and so forth. It's kind of like, what is the one thing that you can kind of, implement more? And also commit to doing it regularly. It's not too much. So, at the beginning of this year, for example, for anyone who listens to the podcast, right, I committed to just, improving my content in that space and just do one podcast a week, right? That is manageable, it's doable. And what are we kind of, we're halfway through the year now, and I have for now managed to do a podcast a week, right? Because that takes time to plan, to write, to record, to upload, etc., etc. So for me to say at the beginning, okay, I want to do like a YouTube video, I want to do a podcast a week, I want to do this, I want to do that, like it's going to be too much, and then everything falls apart. So much like with training or your nutrition or whatever it is, like take on what you think you can take on. Yes, the results may be slower, but I think we often overestimate what we can do in like a short period of time, like a month or two, and vastly underestimate what can be achieved in, a longer stretch of time, 12 months, 2 months, 2 years, 3 years, etc. And, for everyone here, fitness is going to mean different things to them at different points in their lives. And being able to know what works for you and what you can build on and what stays and what you keep and what can kind of fall away as it's not really that effective for you, is stuff that we all are going to learn. So Omani, thanks for that share, because obviously that's something that has really sort of benefited you in what you're doing.
Amazing.
Nice. All right. Healthy people have more willpower than everyone else. So I think a lot of the time we look at people, whether they are healthy or they're achieving something that we want to achieve, and maybe we wish to be more like them. Often, this is the kind of lens that we should be looking through. Like, we ignore the sacrifice, the context, or even the obsession and the negative behaviors actually that led to that person being healthy, right? And so healthy people, or people who we look up to in whatever way, they often, appear like they've got everything figured out. They've got it all balanced, and they've got this, as Marvin says, this superhuman level of self-control. And we tend to like idolize these people. And one of like the biggest things I can sort of share with you here is that gaining or like changing, whether that's fat loss, whether that's growing muscle, whatever, is so much harder than just maintaining. And so for me, as an example, right, I spent I don't know, from 17 to 30 trying to put on as much muscle mass as I could, right? And it was an obsession. And there was a lot of negative behaviors that came with that, or like obsessive behaviors. But the good thing in sort of in hindsight about obsession is that you are so deep into the thing. You're finding out all the information. You understand at a glance what is in this plate of food in front of you in terms of calories and macros. You get your 5 sessions, 6 sessions a week without fail. Like, nothing's getting in your way. Like, that is obsession. And so now, like, dialed down obsession just looks like discipline. It looks like I've got my shit together, and it looks like sort of I'm healthy. But in order to get to that point, I had to be horrifically obsessed. I said no to social occasions. I stayed in my room reading forums about bodybuilding on a Friday night, these sorts of things. That is what leads people to kind of like come back to healthy a lot of the time. And so, like, Manira, I think you mentioned it the other day, kind of, people, there's like people getting faster results, right? It's kind of like, are you understanding of what it takes to get that, and are you willing to do that as well? Because yes, you can sort of super also kind of speed run your way to a result, but it's going to be all encompassing. It has to be an obsession. It's like with all these, Marvin, you mentioned it, the sort of Michael Jordan side of things, all these top performing athletes, like the best in the world, are all wildly obsessed, right? We all want to have their talent. We all want to be like them, whatever sort of discipline that's in. But like, none of us are willing to sacrifice what it takes to do that, along with all of the other genetics and God-given talents that they may have. So I appreciate I rambled on a bit there, Melvin, but any kind of builds up of that?
No, no, no. Good. That was really good. I mean, Abdullah also mentioned mental resilience, rather, I guess a question. And I mean, I would agree with that, right? Because um, oftentimes, like Pete, I mean, we're going to have to preemptively speak about this. We might then have a little bit of a chat around this with Pete and talking about some of the things that he has learned and also had to unlearn, right? Because that obsession then leads to having to unlearn a lot of things that he's, picked up over the years, which weren't so healthy, right? So we won't, maybe let's not delve too deeply into them just yet. Save it for the next one. But yeah, it is really interesting how we're not always willing to do what everyone else is doing. And so we then think that we can't do it, right? Or we just don't understand what they did to get to the point that they're at. And it's not really healthy. Okay,
So yeah, I
so
think. Sorry,
yeah,
go
go
ahead.
ahead, Pete. We
Okay.
think that this
After you, mate. Carry on, carry on, carry on.
we think that there's something wrong with us, right? Like having this very pessimistic view of who we are because we can't do what so and so did, kind of as Pete touched on with Munira. So what we want to do is actually start to think about habit design as opposed to willpower, right? We want to be creating systems that avoid relying on willpower, planning our meals in advance. So, something that I've touched on a couple of times with people is, people don't know what they want to eat. It's like, oh, what do I eat here? What do I do? What do I do? Right? Relying on feelings, similarly to relying on motivation, right? So create systems, right? Start to plan your week in advance. So every Saturday night, sit down for 20 minutes. It probably doesn't even take that much longer than that. And sort of plan what your meals are going to look like. Obviously, we have all these resources in the app, right? In the resources tab with the What Should I Eat guide. You can have a look at that and see some of the meals in which you can start to prepare, looking at things like your protein, your carbohydrates, your fats, your fruits, your vegetables, right? Things like that, creating all these systems, setting an alarm to walk for 10 minutes every 2 hours, right? Or an even better one is to walk 10 minutes after every meal, right? You're essentially creating systems and things that you can do consistently, rather than trying to think that, I have to willpower my way through all of this, right? How can you expect to achieve something if you're not willing to change the habits that you've always done, right? You need to start to create new habits, new skills, and those things aren't going to come, naturally, automatically. Systems need to be sort of put in place to be able to do that.
Yeah, and I think just on that as well, like you mentioned the feelings side of things. And a lot of time from clients we have, oh, but I hate eating the same thing twice, or I like variety, I'm a foodie, and so on and so on. Which is fine, which is absolutely fine. The problem with that is if you are like making, a million and one decisions in the day, you're running around after the kids, you're busy at work, trying to then think about variety and having something different, you have no decisions left in you. Like you have this fatigue from managing all your decisions and stuff during the day that then the easiest thing, if you don't have a system or you don't have structure or you don't have a set of like reliable meals you can go to, is then, you order from outside. Simple. So really like there's always a trade-off, right? If you want to really sort of focus on, let's say, fat loss, right, then you're going to have some element of predictability and boredom and structure into your routine. You can't just wing it every day. And this is one of the things that sort of Marvin alluded to earlier is at the moment, as of what is it, like 3, 4 weeks ago, I've been kind of working on my own sort of, fat loss, right? I want to sort of shed a few kilos. And man, it's difficult. Like honestly, it's really, really difficult knowing or like having variety or not having sort of structure. And so because I was obsessed with stuff back in my 20s, obviously, I've been able to kind of like flick a switch. But even then, it's really challenging. And the things that have helped me the most is like predictability and routine, even if it's boring, right? Because boring, unfortunately, wins 9 times out of 10 when it comes to stuff like this. So you have to repeat, you've got to have the same structure, you've got to do the same things day after day, week after week, because the more you do that for a short period of time, you are going to like again, like fast track the results, right? If you can lock in for 2 months of eating the same things each day, then you will get much faster results than if you are just eating randomly each day. Now, there's always like a middle ground, and rate of progress is sort of depending on that. But I think it's really important to sort of appreciate that, the basics, the structure, the systems, the boring nature of things is always going to win. Variety is all well and good, but variety is often what got us into this place in the first place, right? With like ordering burgers for dinner because you can't be bothered to cook anything, or ordering your Habitain shawarma because it tastes so good on a Friday, whatever. So I think you sort of get my point there.
I thought variety was the spice of life.
It is, but it can come in different ways. Like,
We,
for example, I have the
yeah,
same breakfast, I have same meal number one, I have same meal number two, but dinner, I sort of make it a little bit more exciting. And that's where I get my variety from. So it's variety can happen just, within reason.
being conscious
Jamana,
of that.
actually, great question. We're actually going to create a sort of our next group coaching on this, and this is going to be tactics people can use to make fat loss easier, basically. So whether that is, calorie banking, calorie buffers, postponing the first meal, volume eating, like I think you mentioned before in our last one. These are going to be things that we cover in detail. So yes, it can be used, but still it's very easy to go over, basically.
Awesome. We've got one more myth, right, Pete? Do you want to tackle that last one? We've got quite a few
Oh no,
questions.
we got this picture just quickly. So if you listen to my podcast, which I'm sure you all do, the other week I had an episode all about the AMCC, which is this anterior mid-cingulate cortex within the brain. And just on the topic of willpower, this is something that gets bigger or gets smaller depending on if you use it, right? So it's like the saying, Marvin, you should know this based on your rugby days, sort
Use
of
it or
use it or lose it, right? So if you don't use the ability or the capability, then you're going to lose it. It's going to get weaker, right? So just like with the injury side of things we were talking about earlier, if you don't use your knee or the muscles around the knee, they're going to get weaker. Use it or lose it. And so the same thing is true with this area of the brain, right? And so willpower is not just, a God-given thing. It's not, I mean, I'm sure there's a genetic component to it, but really it's a muscle, in essence, that can be trained, right? It's an area of the brain that can be trained. And just like Amani's saying with her gratitude, it's something that with time can sort of rewire your behavior, your thinking, and your habits. So just like how your muscles get bigger with time, so can this area of the brain, the AMCC. And this is done just like with reps and weights in the gym. It's done by doing things that you don't want to do, doing hard things. And by simply doing what you don't want to do and doing things that are challenging, it makes you more resilient. It gives you more, in inverted commas, willpower. And equally, if you stop doing hard things, it can turn you into like, a couch potato, someone who doesn't want to do anything because it's hard, because it's too difficult, because, right? So you can really, like, I guess the exciting part of this is it takes away or it repositions the locus of control from like an external thing of, oh my God, like this person has so much willpower, or I wish I had willpower, to actually now I can own it. I'm responsible for it. If I do more hard shit, then I'm going to become more resilient and sort of have tenacity within that and be able to follow through on the things that I say. So I think this is quite empowering to people who feel like they can train it, they can own it, they can make it adapt rather than just thinking, ugh, I have no willpower. Alas, I'm done, finished. Nice. So, number 6, if someone gets results faster than you, you're doing something wrong. Now, a lot of the time, I actually had a call yesterday with a potential new client, and she was saying she basically just program hops, tries new diets every couple of weeks because her friend recommends or she sees something on social media. And it's always this thing about, looking for the next best thing. Maybe it's sort of, again, seeing from social media posts about someone losing 20 kilos in 12 weeks, or maybe you're at a family gathering and someone's raving about keto because they've lost 10 kilos in a day or something with that. And it takes away your commitment to what you're doing and what, will work, what will compound with time if you just stick to it. So with this, right, we always have this self-comparison element within ourselves. Social media, it amplifies it. And going back to the point around context, we need to know the context behind what we're being told, what we're being read. Um, you know, I think even just with social media, right, seeing coaches' Instagrams where they show before and afters, and some of them are untrained, bad lighting, with the after post being they've just trained, so they're pumped and they're in good lighting. So the context and the sort of nuance here is really important. And I think, from a sort of macro point of view, the results really have many different variables attached to them, right? So just because both people are on a fat loss journey, it doesn't mean that they're doing the same kind of thing, right? So genetics can play a huge part in this, sort of hormones associated with that. The age, right, is another big thing. We've had this where like, with people saying that they want to achieve something that they achieved when they were 20 years old. They're now 40 with like four kids, and they want to get back to where they got to in sort of university when they could train at whatever point, they could eat whatever they want, they had a higher metabolism, they had no responsibilities, right? So it's always important understanding these sorts of contexts. Same with people who are just a beginner now versus, someone who trained as was an athlete many, many years ago. Job roles, sleep effects, sort of level of adherence, and the lifestyle, right? What are you willing to do versus, what they are willing to do or what you were doing in the past? So it's really important to have this context to things and to compare yourself really quite fairly as well. Because again, going back to the kind of, Michael Jordan example, is would you be willing to do what it took him to be the best in the world? Definitely not. Definitely not. Marvin, anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to, go ahead, be my guest, right? I think Abdullah mentioned something really interesting here in the chat, sort of talking about the problem with fat loss is that people tend to underestimate the amount of fat needed to be lost. And this is him speaking from personal experience. And I think this one comes especially from, of course, lack of context, not understanding all the things that go into this, all the behaviors and genetics and age and the level of adherence. But also, I think it's just the experience of what they've gone through before, right? Most people that we coach have done all sorts of crazy things in the past, and so when you lost 5 kilos from eating only in a 4 hour window, yeah, of course, but it wasn't sustainable. It didn't work at the time, therefore it didn't work, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't be having the conversation that we're having, and so there's this overestimation of what we can do or what's true based on what we've experienced before. And it's really interesting how sometimes we don't take that into consideration as well. We fail to put context into the picture here.
Nice. So we now come into the questions from sort of what people shared when they were signing up for the sort of the meet. So I guess Marvin, we can just tag team these ones.
Yes.
But I think the first one, I think maybe it was from Dania. Rest is more important than the workout. What are your thoughts there?
Rest within the workout, I'm guessing.
But I think like recovery post, like
Oh, I
outside of
see.
training.
Recovery post-workout. I think they're equally important. If rest was more important than the workout, then you wouldn't need to work out. I think it's equal weight to resting as we do to workout, right? Because working out is a stress. And if you're pouring more and more things into your stress bucket and then not being able to recover from the stress, because the body needs stress, otherwise we just would be flailing around doing nothing. It's important to have the stress, but we need to recover just as hard as we train. And recovery doesn't have to look like what the professional athletes are doing with the Normatec boots and the sauna, cold plunge, and again optimizing everything. Right? It can be as simple as hitting your nutrition targets,
And
sleeping
sleep.
consistently 7 to 9 hours a day. I mean, those things are hard enough. I love how people want to do 5,000 different things before we just tackle the basics that are hard enough on their own. So I would say 50-50, but stick to being simple and keep it at nutrition and sleep.
Yeah, and I think Dania, this comes actually into the next question as well. How many sets per week is needed for growth? And you were saying here, is it 3 days on, 1 day rest? Is it 4 days on, 2 days a week rest? It kind of really depends on the starting point, right? And so, same thing with how many sets needed for growth is if you are a beginner and have never done any training before in your life, right? Then you are going to need less than what maybe someone who's been training for 4 years needs. So, in that case, if you are a beginner and you're starting out, 3 strength sessions a week is going to give you enough stimulus and also is going to give you enough time to recover. Someone starting having 5 sessions a week and 2 days rest is probably going to be a little bit too much because so I'm just reading Giovanna's message here. And the same thing with the sets, right? If you are a total beginner, you may only train a muscle, I don't know, 5 sets or 6 sets a week and still see great progress. It all depends on what your body is used to. Because as we've mentioned before, right? Same thing with the tanning analogy. is if you are a seasoned tanner, then you're going to need more time in the sun to get tanned. So if you have been training for a long time, you will need more sets within reason, caveated, um, assuming they are progressively overloaded, right? So I would worry less about how many sets per week, but the intensity of which you're taking those sets to, if that makes sense. Because you could have 20 sets per muscle per week, but if you're lifting like dog shit and you're only pushing at 60%, then you're not really going to get anything out of it. And I guess the same thing is true when we talk about, in the session, within sets, like Jemana's asking here, is in order to perform maximally again, whether that's post session or each set, you are going to need a certain amount of time, right? Just physiologically. Like, so Jemana, if you do a set of squats and you've exhausted yourself in that set, then your body, like, literally needs to regenerate the sort of the energy it has, the ATP within the muscle cells, and that takes a certain amount of time. So if you are, doing a set, you're pushing yourself to failure, you could need anywhere from 1.5 minutes to 3 minutes to recover fully. And so this is why it's important to log your weights and your reps so that you can see if you're performing at the same level again, right? So if, for example, you manage 12 reps on the first set, and then the next set you only rested like 30 seconds and you managed freaking 6 reps, then you know you're not sufficiently recovered. Whereas if you rested for 2 minutes and you could hit 12 reps again, then you're sufficiently recovered. We would much rather that latter example where you're resting a little bit more so that you can perform at your 100% capacity than cutting the rest down to like 10, 20 seconds, and then your performance suffers and your performance drops. So it's the same thing with training sessions per week. Is if you are training one day, 2 days, 3 days, and then you're absolutely wrecked, and then the fourth day you can barely lift an arm or barely train, then you need to kind of bring in more rest. And Doreen, that there's like various different components of that because like Doreen, some muscles are bigger. Some movements are more like compound lifts, so they kind of use more muscles. So for example, like let's talk about a split squat. Horrible exercise. It's going to kind of use a lot of muscles, and also there's like the cardiovascular element of it. You're going to be breathing, you're going to be sort of chugging air after something like that. So ultimately find, I think, Jemana, I think you're in good company. Find like what works well for you so that you can push at the same level. So yesterday, I don't know if you saw, like I posted this YouTube video on my social on Instagram, and I actually was doing this. Marvin, if only you renamed yourself to like, some a client name. Yeah, so I recommend you watch the video I put on my story for YouTube because that is me talking about going to failure and giving examples of that. So I, at the end of that, demonstrated what going to failure looks like with a Bulgarian split squat at the end. Horrible. I needed like 5 minutes rest before I used the other leg. And obviously, I had to do the other leg. I couldn't just cut the video there. So, I would say if you're looking to understand more about failure, go and watch that YouTube video in my story because that will kind of take you along the journey of what's what. And, will stop me rattling on for now. Marvin, I'll let you take over the protein portion.
Yeah, Jemana is doing cardio with weights, resting for 10 seconds. I expect to see the weights double now that you're going to be doing appropriate rest. But if you eat huge portions of protein, the body will not absorb it. I think that's a myth that we might have tackled already. Your body can absorb way more protein than we think, right? There was a myth that was going around saying one of it was because of supplement companies saying you can only absorb 20 grams of protein at a time. And so people would then end up having, 3 scoops over, 3 scoops over the day, as opposed to just doing 1 scoop and eating their food. And so case in point, people end up, buying more protein and so on and so forth. But your body can absorb way more protein than you actually think. And I don't think I would have ever met someone who eats more than 100, 200 grams of protein in a sitting. Most of us here are not Eddie Hall and consuming that amount of food in one sitting anyway.
Yeah, I think the
Um,
most important thing there is, get your protein in, usually across the course of the day for people in this sort of group here, because most people struggle getting enough protein in. So, if you get something first thing in the morning, whether that's 20, 30, 40, 50 grams of protein, that sets you up for the day. Whereas if you have no protein in the morning, then you're waiting for lunch, and then you're chasing it at dinner, and then you're not hungry, and then, you're kind of suffering there. So think about total protein across the course of the day. Ideally, start early if you're someone who gets full and you struggle to eat that amount. Now, cardio burns calories more than strength training. We've got a whole different sort of thing on this, a whole resource based on this exactly. So, in short, it may do, but the benefit of what you want in terms of fat loss is going to be greater when you do strength training over cardio. Cardio can maybe burn more calories, but you're not going to be able to do it for a long period of time. And also it's going to send the appetite through the roof, which means you're going to eat more calories as well. Working out daily with no breaks at all leads to better or faster. Well, you can't outtrain your body's recovery. So that would be the main point there is yes, you can train. And also like working out daily, it kind of depends, right? Because if you do 2 exercises a day, fine, you're good. Whereas if you were doing 7, 8, 9 exercises a day, you're going to sort of basically run yourself into the ground and may risk injury or illness or something like that. Last of all, how long it actually takes to lose body fat? Well, it depends. How long is a piece of string? How much are you willing to do? How tight are you willing to be with everything? So, really kind of a general sort of idea on this is how long did it take you to gain the body fat that you have, right? It probably came a year, 2, 3, 4 years, right? To gain, I don't know, 20 kilos. So that is going to be, again, something that comes over a long period of time. Maybe you could lose 20 kilos over the course of the year. So these things are always, always important. And yes, خلاص finished.